This is the sad case of Celine Conroy, a young mother of 3 children. Celine was born and bred in the north inner city of Dublin. She was described by her family as a sweet and quiet child who never wanted much. When her parents split up, this, like for many children, had an adverse effect on her. Her father, because of the breakdown of the marriage, was not around very much. By her mid-teens, Celine had fallen in with the bad crowd. And when she was 14, she met a guy, Paul Hickey, and soon they began dating. They would start experimenting with drugs, and Celine became addicted to heroin. When Celine was 18, her family intervened and sent her to stay with her aunt in the UK, but she would only stay there for a year. When she returned to Dublin, she rekindled her romance with Paul. Paul was from an area called Darndale on the north side of Dublin city. His family were part of the drug trade that was prominent in the 80s and 90s. His father, Paul Gash, was one of the biggest heroin dealers of that time, as the drug problem tore through the inner city of Dublin. Following somewhat in his father's footsteps, Paul was known to Gardaí as a violent, petty criminal and drug user. He had several offences for robbery, drugs and violent altercations. It was believed he was a member of a professional gang of thieves. The gang was believed to be the first armed gang to target cash vans, delivering money to ATMs. Although some of the gang were eventually caught, Paul would not be one of them. With Paul and Celine now back together after she returned from the UK, her old habits with drugs began again. Soon, not only would she be addicted to heroin, but she would find herself pregnant. Not wanting to be addicted while carrying her baby, she enrolled into drug counselling therapy and signed up for a methadone program. This program, which was introduced in 1998, was controversial at the time, as many believed abstinence would be a better treatment than substitution. It ultimately had a very poor track record of curing the addiction. However, it did decrease the transmission of disease and it improved the health and well-being of the addict. When Celine's son was 3 years old, she gave birth to a little girl, and then 4 years later she would have her third child, another girl. By this time, Celine, Paul and their 3 children were living in a derelict block of flats on Buckingham Street in Dublin's north inner city. These 3-building flats, called Sean Tracy House, were built in the 1960s amid a mass social housing construction in the centre of Dublin. The movement was brought about over housing conditions of the tenements at that time. 3 tenements had collapsed in mid-1963, which resulted in several deaths. The other tenements remaining were pulled down and replaced by the government with purpose-built housing. But these flats were built with no social construct, like playgrounds and local shops. In the 80s and 90s, as the heroin epidemic ripped through pockets of Dublin's inner city, complexes like Sean Tracy House became areas of antisocial behaviour. High levels of unemployment, along with poor housing and lack of facilities for young people, was a breeding ground for drug use. As the new century rolled around, it was decided that the government would clean up these areas, and by the year 2000, Dublin City Council started to demolish these complexes in preparation for new housing that were more family orientated. By 2003, the Sean Tracy House flats were to be demolished as part of the urban renewal scheme. But by 2005 it was still standing due to delays. By then there was only a few tenants still living there, including Celine, Paul and their children. Celine's mother also lived in one of the flats. These flats were in terrible condition. They were damp, rat-infested, boarded-up windows, with squatters that were addicted to drugs. Although these conditions were horrific for Celine and the children, Celine was hanging on there in the hopes of getting relocated to a place where she grew up and had support of her family and friends. She had seen other neighbours relocated to the suburbs of Dublin, where they knew no one, and Celine did not want this, as there was a big chance she'd slip back into old habits if she didn't have her support. Celine was strong-willed. Not only did she beat her addiction, she looked after her children very well. She made sure they were well dressed and clean, going to school, and made sure they were well fed. She hung on, living in terrible conditions, in the hopes that delaying the city council from demolition of the flats would force them to relocate her somewhere nearby, so she had the support she needed, and so her addiction wouldn't rear its ugly head again. Everything Celine did, she did for her family. Unfortunately, the same couldn't be said for Paul. He continued taking drugs and showed no sign of wanting to sort his life out. Celine's family didn't exactly like Paul, but said she seemed to be happy with him. But we all know how someone is well able to hide the truth from family and friends. Paul was physically and emotionally abusive, and he would swear the children to secrecy when they witnessed him beating their mother. In other words, he threatened them. In 2005, Celine and her little family were still waiting to be rehoused, but there was no sign of this happening. Celine and Paul decided to go on a 2-month holiday to a holiday resort outside Alicante in Spain. It was something the family had done each summer over the last 3 years, and it gave them a break from the conditions they were living in. They would stay in a Spanish villa owned by Paul's father that was afforded by his drug-dealing days. The complex where the villa stood was called the Marina Oasis near Costa Blanca and was 20 minutes south of Alicante. It was mainly Irish, German and British holidaymakers. It was also a notorious area for Irish criminals. Paul's reasons for going to Spain greatly differed to Celine's. Paul's draw to there was the easy access to diazepam, which he could easily enjoy there because of the legal easy access to the drug to registered addicts. This would mean he could spend his holiday getting high on cheap, legal gear. Celine, though, could not. Before she left for Spain, she was given methadone to last her 2 months while she was away. The family arrived in Spain in June, and the first few weeks went fine. The children were happy getting to the pool every day and the sunshine. But by the end of August, Celine was anxious to get back to Dublin, as her methadone supply was running low and the children were due back in school. Celine wanted to be back in time to prepare everything for them. But Paul had other ideas. He wanted to stay, as by now he was having a drug and drink fueled holiday, and things were getting out of hand. Paul was becoming more erratic and volatile, and poor Celine was suffering in trying to keep it together while her methadone supply was running low. The neighbours would complain about drug and drink fueled parties going on at Hickey's villa, and they confronted Paul numerous times about this. They would hear screaming matches going on between Paul and Celine, and all I can think of is what those poor children were subjected to. On the 20th of August, Paul's aunt and her teenage son were to join the couple and their children at the villa. Her name was Norma. When she arrived, she noticed the volatility in Paul, like she had never seen in him before. By August the 27th, things were really getting out of hand. Paul was playing loud music and neighbours were not happy again, and again they confronted Paul. Paul's aunt would say that Paul's change in character was very sudden. He was a doting father and she didn't understand what had happened to change his character so much. Personally, I think she was seeing his true character for the first time, but that's just my opinion. On the 29th of August, Paul brought his young cousin Aaron to a medical centre for something minor. It was several miles away from the villa they were staying in. While his cousin was inside getting treatment, Paul drove off and left him there. The poor boy was left stranded with no mobile phone to contact his mother. When Paul returned without Aaron, Nora, his aunt, went spare. Where was her son? Norma eventually got to the clinic and found him. By the next day, Paul was again acting erratic and demanding. He wanted to go out that night, but poor Celine didn't, as she was feeling increasingly sick without her supply of methadone, but Paul insisted she get ready to go out that night. Norma would later say that on this particular night, that once Celine was dressed, he insisted she paraded up and down outside the villa for him. She said poor Celine was extremely uncomfortable with this, and eventually Paul told her to go back inside the villa, and then they decided not to go out. Norma and her son, though, did go out, and when they returned that night they were locked out. Norma tried the door and knocked on it, but no one came to let them in. The villa was in darkness, and so they decided to sleep on the porch, using cushions from the chairs for comfort. The following morning, Norma phoned her husband and explained the situation and that she wanted to come home. Norma, by midday, still couldn't get into the villa, and so she called to a neighbour who had a spare key. She returned to the villa with keys in hand. On opening the front door, she was faced with a terrible scene. There on the floor lay Celine in a pool of blood. Celine was naked, except for a pair of shorts, and her head was covered by a towel. Norma was horrified and started to scream. She was terrified to what she discovered, and as the doors to the bedroom were closed, she was afraid to enter in case the children were dead also. She ran into the neighbour's villa and asked them to check on the children and ring the police for help. When the police arrived, they found Hickey in a highly agitated state. Police held back and waited for reinforcements before they entered the villa, but when they were told that there were children inside, 2 policemen took it upon themselves to enter the villa in order to rescue the children. There they would find the 3 children unharmed. A standoff ensued as the police tried to keep Hickey separate from the children. Eventually a doctor had to be called, and he gave him a sedative to subdue him and bring him into custody. He was removed from the villa and brought to a local medical centre to have blood taken to test for drugs. He was then brought to the local police station for questioning. The children were released into Norma's care, and she looked after them in a nearby villa. The children were blessed to have her there, especially in a foreign country, not speaking the language, and they only being babies. They must have been so terrified after what they had witnessed. Celine was examined at the villa, and initially the police thought she had been bludgeoned to death with an object, but it would turn out to be stomping, kicking and fists that were the cause of her death. Her poor face was completely destroyed. On the 30th of August, Hickey appeared in court in Alicante on suspicion of killing Celine. Bail was refused. Hickey's father turned up for the hearing, and on leaving the court he pulled his t-shirt over his face and gave reporters the 2 fingers. This is the kind of scumbag family they were dealing with, and there's more disrespect to come. Also, if we think the Irish legal system is slow, it is no comparison to Spain. It would take months before a charge would even be made against Hickey. Their legal system is beyond dog slow. It could be up to 3 years before Hickey would stand trial for killing Celine. Hickey was remanded in Alicante's prison, and a psychiatric evaluation was done, as it is standard in Spain, and Hickey was deemed as high risk to self-harm and was put on suicide watch. He was also kept away from other prisoners, as what he had done to Celine put him at high risk to other prisoners, who might want to cause him harm for the killing of a young mother of 3 small children. On the day her mother learned that poor Celine had been killed, she had been diagnosed with cancer. She had been allowed to leave hospital to be with family, but was too sick to travel to Spain. Celine's father made the heartbreaking trip instead with relatives to bring the children and Celine back to Ireland. The pathologist began the post-mortem on Celine and concluded that the attack on her began at around 9 p.m. on the 30th of August. Hickey hit her until she fell to the floor and then continued to hit her, kick her and stomp on her. She then lay dying for a total of 7 hours as Hickey showered, put the children to bed and went to sleep himself. All her teeth except 2 were knocked out, and her blonde hair had turned olive white from the shock of the beating she received. Celine received 35 injuries, 14 of them to her face and neck. She was beaten to unrecognition. When family members were brought to identify her, they couldn't, and they thought they were shown the wrong body. But one family member recognised a ring she always wore. When Celine's father went to collect the children, they opened up to him and they told them what they had witnessed, the whole killing, and the 5-year-old described in detail how her father had beaten her mother. Celine's father was horrified at this piece of information. The older children had screamed and begged their father to stop as he continuously beat their mother, and the baby had sat strapped in her buggy crying. I have no words. 6 days later, the family returned to Ireland without Celine's remains. Because of their strict legal procedures, the Spanish had ruled to keep Celine's body as evidence because of it possibly being a murder inquiry. When the family returned to Ireland with the children, Celine's family took them in and got full custody. Hickey's family made no attempt to make contact with the children. The children received counselling for what they went through, but this was abandoned because they just would not talk about what happened that night. But Celine's father said they would resume it as soon as the children were ready. The baby was only a year old, so she does not remember anything, but the 5-year-old and 8-year-old remembers everything. When Celine's mother, Sandra, went through her daughter's belongings, she came across 3 little angels, presuming that when Celine bought them in Spain, they represented her 3 children. This is how Celine saw them, as her little angels. The Spanish authorities informed the family that it could be up to 2 years before they release Celine's body, as the trial may have to be concluded before releasing her. They told the family it was up to the magistrate's discretion. Sandra, Celine's mother, gave interviews and spoke of her and how she had no idea Hickey treated her so badly, even though they all lived in the same block of flats. Celine, like many other victims of domestic violence, stay silent and keep secrets, in fear for their own life and the life of their family. This is such a common factor, unfortunately. On the 25th of September 2005, on Celine's son's 9th birthday, a vigil was held at Sean Tracy House Flats in memory of Celine. Many people turned up, including Celine's 3 children. The Irish government were also putting pressure on the Spanish to return Celine's body due to Sandra doing interviews in order to make public their plight, to get Celine home to be buried so the healing process could begin. On October 15, 2005, the family gathered at Dublin Airport in anticipation of the arrival of Celine's body. Finally, the Spanish authorities had released her to her family. Celine's uncle had travelled with her as they could not bear her to travel alone. On the 19th of October, Celine was finally laid to rest in Glasnevin Cemetery. Bagpipes were played as the procession left the church, and flowers were laid at her resting place, as well as at the Sean Tracy House Flats. It was a totally harrowing scene. In the months to come, Celine's wish would come true for her children. Her brother Niall and his partner got a house in Summerhill in Dublin, and they raised the 3 children together, along with their own child. A family of 6, all happy, content, and most importantly, all together. Celine must have been so happy looking down on them. In February 2006, the villa where Celine was killed was put up for sale, and the money from the sale was to be used in Hickey's defence. Celine's parents were worried that they could now afford a top lawyer for his defence. The villa was said to fetch over €300,000. In May 2006, Celine's family were informed that the trial was set to start in October of that same year, but €10,000 would be needed to represent the Conroys, and the Irish government would not provide this money. The family felt that without a Spanish lawyer, and only depending on the prosecution, a challenge would not be put forward towards the defence enough for them to get justice. But they need not have worried. The community of the north inner city of Dublin came together and eventually raised more than €11,000. By October 2006, there was still no sign of a trial date. In October 2007, Celine's mother Sandra gave an interview and told the reporter that her biggest fear now was that she would not live to see justice, as her cancer had come back and she was fighting to stay alive. In October 2008, a month before the trial was to begin, details of the prosecution's case was leaked to media outlets in Spain. It was reported that they wanted a 20-year sentence, and when Hickey got out, they would be asking for him to be barred from seeing his children for 10 years. They also wanted compensation to be paid to each child and to Celine's parents. Hickey was to pay €30,000 to each child and €20,000 each to Celine's mother and father. A week before the trial, prosecution stated they wanted the 2 older children to give evidence, But since the children had not seen their father since the killing, the family felt it would be too traumatic for them. The family asked for their statements to be enough, and the prosecution agreed. On the 11th of November 2008, trial began, and straight away it was dramatic. Hickey had agreed to a plea deal. None of Celine's family were allowed into the courtroom, even though about 20 people from Ireland had travelled there. Hickey arrived at the courthouse, and as he was led through a sea of photographers, he stuck his tongue out. No surprise there then. His plea deal was 15 years in a Spanish prison, 5 years less than what the prosecution were looking for. He admitted to killing Celine under diminished responsibility because of the number of drugs he had taken. Celine's family were advised to take the deal, and he would be charged with homicide without forethought or foresight. It was a lesser charge of murder, but a higher charge than manslaughter. The defence, the prosecution and the Conroy family all met and agreed to the terms. For the final part of the court proceedings, Sandra was allowed into the court. She had to sit at the back and was warned that there was to be no emotional outbursts, as what Hickey had done to Celine was read out. Hickey yawned the whole way through as the evidence was being read out. But when it was his turn to speak before sentencing, he apologised. The jury then retired to mull over whether they would accept the plea deal. They agreed to the terms, and his time served on remand was to be deducted from the 15-year sentence. But with remission, he could maybe only serve 7 years. As Hickey was being led out from the court, Celine's family hurled abuse and insults at him. Hickey retorted, "So what?" As things were getting out of hand, Celine's family surged forward, and one of them called him, quote, "a scumbag." "Ah, don't you just love it? It's becoming one of my favourite quotes." Hickey replied, "You shut your mouth, you." Not a quote most Irish killers like, which I'm finding out from personal experience. As Hickey was leaving court after sentencing, Celine's family and friends cheered as he left, and Hickey retorted again by giving the middle finger with both his cuffed hands. After court, the prosecution announced that despite Hickey saying he killed Celine due to drugs and alcohol, it was found that there was only the sedative in his system that the doctor had given him to calm him down so the police could bring him into custody. In other words, Hickey was in full control of his faculties when he beat Celine to death. Sandra, Celine's mother, also spoke afterwards and stated that if she had known exactly what had been done to her daughter, she would have never agreed to the plea deal. Hickey also never paid any compensation money to the Conroy family, as ordered by the Spanish court. Over the years, Hickey's father continued to walk the streets, dealing drugs until he no longer could. He died in 2019. In December 2020, Hickey was released and he returned to Dublin inner city. His appearance after 15 years in prison had changed dramatically. He was overweight, bloated, scruffy, balding and with a beard. He was homeless and was put up in a bed and breakfast by the city council. A few days after his return to Dublin, he was spotted in the area of Summerhill in the north inner city where his children lived. If anyone knows this area, it's not a place to go as an outsider or as a person where you killed one of their own or have children to protect. Hickey made this mistake. He was set upon by a group of youths wielding a metal bar. He was badly beaten and it was reported to the Gardaí. Hickey was then moved to a new accommodation away from that area of Summerhill. Gardaí, though, did warn him he was not safe, and social media warnings of him being back in Dublin say in the comments, I presume by locals, quote, his days are numbered. I will leave you with Celine's mam's words. I cannot forgive Hickey. When he killed Celine, he killed part of me. She was my shadow, and now I've lost my shadow.